Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Terumos, chapter 1, Halacha 5. This is part 2 of this year, and in the Art Scroll, we're on 14a1. Now, we ended off yesterday where the Gemara is going to be looking at the first section of the Mishnah, which stated that if someone separated Truma from oil on behalf of olives that will be crushed, it is valid Truma, but he must separate out Truma again. And I want to explain how this is and what's going on with all this. This is a case where we've separated finished produce that is wine or oil, olive oil, on behalf of either grapes or olives. This is unfinished produce. And later on, we're going to get into what happens if you're separating wine or olive oil on behalf of a different kind of finished product. Well, not oil or wine, but raisins or olives for eating. Both are going to be finished product. What's going to happen then? So in the first part of this year, in this part 2, we're going to be covering this maloket between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi. And Rabbi Yochanan is saying, and it's unusual, but the reason is going to be like Rabbi Meir. It's going to be to preserve the water for the Mayim Aduma, that's the sprinkling, to make sure. And again, this is all a rabbinic issue. And the idea is that if you've gone ahead and you've done this separation incorrectly for unfinished produce for finished produce, and then the product got lost, they're saying you have to go out and separate it again. And the reason why, as Rabbi Meir is saying, the primary reason is not theft for a kohen, which there is that reason, but the reason is because we want to preserve and make sure that people are using the Mayim Aduma. Because otherwise what would happen is somebody can come and just say, well, maybe I have tumas met, and I didn't wet my hands, and I just cut these olives off the tree, or I just cut the grapes off the vine, and I didn't press it into wine, and they're not tamei. It didn't undergo hechsher. And here you go, Mr. Cohn, you go deal with it. And the sages didn't want that. They were saying two different reasons. One is that they want to make sure that you're doing finished product, because they're saying, look, if you're taking out 2% and you're losing part of the olive oil or part of the olive and part of the grape from the skins and the pits and whatever is being pressed, and you have this unedible pulp that is left over, well, the Kohen is actually getting less than 2%. And they want to make sure that when you're calculating it, you're giving them the finished product and you're taking out your approximation of your Trumas Gedola from there. And they didn't want like that. But in this part of the shiur, we're going to be getting into what happens if you went ahead and you separated it, but you did an incorrect separation, and then it got lost. This is a rabbinic thing, and they're saying you have to go separate it again. And why do you have to go separate it again? They want to make sure that you have to go make yourself tahor, go get the Mayim Aduma water, get sprinkled on you, and then go separate out the oil or the wine again. So in this case where it says if somebody separated out truma from oil on behalf of olives that are going to be crushed, again, that's the opposite case in this Mishnah of what we were talking about. This is going to be the finished product on behalf of the unfinished product. The Gemara is going to limit the obligation to separate truma a second time. And it says it applies where the first truma is not extant. In other words, it's lost. And only in this case, the sages require the second separation so that the chatas water will not fall into disuse. Now, I want to make it very, very clear here that if somebody separated out truma in a permitted way and then it gets lost, one is not obligated to replace it. And the Rosh Cirilio is saying that this enactment is only where it's being separated in a forbidden way, and then it gets lost. So, that would be like, oil on behalf of olives. Now, again, you're supposed to be separating out the finished product. So if you separate out olive oil and then you lost it, the sages are saying, no, you don't have to go out and separate it again. And then they're saying, but in the case of this, where you did it incorrectly and then you lost it, now you have to go separate it again. The idea is to make sure the patas water is still being used. Now, there's really, it looks like there's two cases, but there's really four cases here. You have the maloket between Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel, okay, and that's going to be occurring earlier in chapter 1. And what was that case? That's talking about unfinished product on behalf of finished product. Again, that's going to be like your grapes on behalf of wine. You're separating grapes, and you're saying, I'm going to do it for this pile of grapes and also for the wine as well that I did. And they're saying, and that's the maloket between Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel. Bet Shammai over there is saying that the grapes that you did is going to be not valid, but the part that you separated on the wine is valid. In other words, they're saying one part of the separation is not valid, one part of the separation is valid. Bet Hillel says that neither part is valid. In other words, they're saying inside of there, all you did was lift up a mixture, and in this mixture, you have something where there's a mixture of something that's separated and not separated. You basically have a mixture in your hand. And basically they disqualify both. In other words, they're disqualifying the grapes and they're also disqualifying the wine. And they're saying neither is going to be valid. So Rabbi Yossi, when he's looking at this opposite case, right, he's saying that the separation for olive oil on behalf of olives, he's going to be saying, in this case, this is going to be valid. And he's going to be saying, if you lost it, you lost it. You don't need to separate it again. Rabbi Meir is saying that you're not supposed to do it, but if you did it and then you lost it, you have to separate it again. That's the source of the maloket. So really it's like there's four cases here. The Gemara says, but if the first truma is still existing and one, just designates it again and then it's enough. So what happens if you went ahead and you separated the olive oil on behalf of the olives, and the part that I separated from the olive oil still exists, it didn't get lost? Are you going to have to go out and redesignate all of these ties? You went and separated out olive oil here, and you said, not only am I separating out on the olive oil, I'm also separating out on these olives that I'm going to turn into olive oil. And I didn't lose this time. So what happens in that case? Well, the original oil is still going to be available. And then it's talking about the case where after that, the olives are then pressed. So in this case, there's no need to separate a second portion of the truma for the new oil. And it's basically, you're redesignating the original portion. And you're going to call it truma again. And the purpose of this redesignation is to show that the original separation was forbidden, and that the truma should have been separated at this point. And after now that the olives are now converted into olive oil, then it's like it's fixed. So the Gemara is going to give another ruling about truma where you're separating oil on behalf of olives, and now it gets lost. And it's saying, in this case, a second portion has to be separated. So the Brisa is going to talk about this second portion. There's a Brisa that taught that the second portion of Truma may not be eaten until one separates Truma and ties on its behalf. Now, we're not talking here about Truma Gedola. We're talking about the other Truma. What is that? That's the Truma Meiser. So generally, you have to take out Truma Gedola and the Truma Meiser to make sure it doesn't have the Tevel obligation. And they're saying over here that what happens if a Cohen came and he had this second portion? Does he have to go out and separate the other sets of ties? No, he could just eat it. But in the case of a regular Yisrael who went ahead and has this penalty, and he has to go and separate out the second set of truma ties again because he lost it, and it wasn't done correctly in the beginning. Now, the second set of ties, it does have to have the next set taken out. In other words, the second set of ties, you have to take out the portion for the Levi, and then you have to give the rest of it over to the Goan. So, in other words, the oil, the idea is that you don't need to separate truma from the second portion, and you're not obligated in truma because the oil from which it was removed has already been exempted from its truma obligation by the first portion. The first portion was separated from oils on behalf of olives, and now over here, when the Brisa says that truma must be removed from the second portion, it refers not to actual truma, but to the truma meiser, which must be separated from the meiser rishon. And so the Brisa's word for tithes is referring to all the other tithes besides truma meiser. So the Gemara asks and says, what is the law regarding the first portion of the truma? In other words, you have two portions that were taken out. You have the first one that was done incorrectly, and you have this second one that the rabbis are saying you have to do again. So the question is, if the first portion of truma was not lost, and the olives from which it was separated were converted into oil, what do you do now? In other words, in the case that we were just looking at, what happens if you're taking out olive oil, on behalf of oil olives that you're about to crush, and then you crushed it? It says, okay, you just redesignate it. But what happens if you do it where now you've separated out the olives on behalf of oil, and then you went ahead and you processed the olives? Now what? So that's the reverse case. And what's done now? The Gemara answers, it says this could be derived from that which a Brisa teaches, which says, if after separating truma from oil of olives, somebody went back and made the olives into oil or grapes into wine, he designates the first truma and calls it truma again, and he does not separate a second portion of truma. And this is telling us that one needs to designate the tithes, and he calls it truma again. In other words, if you went ahead and basically you don't need to designate a second portion, you just are basically redesignating the first portion. And the thing is there's no obligation to separate trumas meiser and tithes from the first portion of truma because it's regular truma, which can be exempt from all the tithes. The only deficiency is that it was lost. So the sages are requiring a second portion of truma so that the chatas water doesn't fall into use. And that's going to be the way the Mara Fulda reads this. So the Mishnah goes on to the next part, and this is going to be talking about where you have one process thing and you're separating it out on another process thing. So in this case, we're going to be dealing with wine on behalf of raisins, and we're going to be dealing with olive oil on behalf of preserved olives for eating. Mishnah said one may separate oil as truma on behalf of preserved olives or wine on behalf of grapes that one intends to make into raisins. And the Gemara notes a contradiction between the ruling, and the ruling appears toward the end of the Mishnah. And it says that we learned in the section of the Mishnah that follows. It says, one may not separate truma from something whose processing is completed on something whose processing is not completed. Well, we already covered that, right? We know that. We know that you can't separate out olive oil for olives. We know that you're not supposed to do it, and they're going to make you do it again. And basically the Mishnah maintains that this truma is valid after the fact, says the Gemara, but one may not separate it in the first place. So it looks like maybe this contradicts what we were talking about, that even in the first place, one may separate truma from wine on behalf of grapes that will be made into raisins, and these grapes would still be appear to be unprocessed. So, but the Mishnah permits separating truma from wine on their behalf. In other words, that maybe you're in the process of smoothing these, and these are out drying now on the rooftop, and they're still grapes, they're still not raisins yet, but you've already smoothed it, and you've already have designated that this is going to undergo hechsher, and the drying process on the roof and you've smoothed it. Now it's time to take out the tithes. Now, yes, it's not a raisin yet, but can you separate this out? Yes. Why? Because you've already designated it for this use. You've already designated it. Yes, it's not a raisin yet, but you've started the process of turning it into a raisin. So the Gemara is going to suggest and reject an answer. It's going to say that you might argue that this case is different because one is separating truma from something whose processing is completed. That's going to be wine. On something whose processing is not yet completed. In other words, it's in the process of being turned into a raisin, but it's not a raisin yet. And we learned in the Mishnah over in Maestros 1.4, it says the processing of dried pomegranate seeds, raisins, and dried carobs is considered complete from when somebody heaps them into a pile. So in other words, even after the grapes have been made into raisins, they're not completely processed until they've been heaped into a pile. So the grapes have not yet been made into raisins that are completely processed yet. The Gemara answers, and it says that Rabbi Yossi ben Yossi said in the name of Rabbi Yitzhak ben Lazar, says there's no prohibition against separating truma from something whose processing is completed on behalf of something whose processing is not yet completed, except regarding the product that will be processed on the threshing floor in a vat. In other words, the prohibition is limited to grapes and olives that are unprocessed in the sense that they have yet to be made into oil or wine in a vat. But if they will not be made into oil or wine in either way, basically you're going to be turning them into raisins, then it's not subject to that prohibition. So you could separate truma on their behalf even before the processing is finished, and therefore the Mishnah allows somebody to designate wine as truma for grapes that will be made into raisins, even though they have not been finished in the processing for that purpose. So, once you take the grapes and you put them up on the roof, they've undergone hechsher, and that means that it can become tameh, and because you've already declared that you're processing it, you've desired it to start to use it as food, and so if it becomes wet, then it can be an issue. So basically, by going and doing that act, that's a legally significant act that basically turned it on as hechsher. Now, yes, it's not finished yet. It's not a finished product. It's not a raisin yet. But you've undergone something that is in the process. And what they're saying here is they're saying, look, the only cases where you're having for olives and grapes where you're not allowed to take from, this oil and do it on the oil olives is where these oil olives are also going to be turned into oil, where this is going to be, crushed and made also into wine. But if you've done it for a different use, it's going to be allowed. In other words, that they're just saying that all of what we've been talking about in the Mishnah is limited to where you're going to put them into the vat and you're going to process it there. And so you have something that's processed the same way in both cases. Both of them are being made in a vat, and they're saying that you're not supposed to separate olive oil for olives or wine for grapes, where the oil is going to be made into the olives are going to be made into oil, and the wine is going to be the grapes are going to be made into wine. You're not supposed to do it. But if you've started the processing to turn them into something else that's a finished product, that you can do. The Mishnah stated that if someone separated truma from oil on behalf of olives that are intended for eating, so again, this is going to be this is a finished product also on behalf of something that's a finished product. So this Mishnah is implying that somebody's allowed to designate oil as truma on behalf of olives that are intended for eating. And by the way, there's going to be two different kinds of olives that we're talking about, and implied also two different kinds of grapes. One is going to be an olive that's an inferior olive for making oil, and that it's called a collusion. And this kind of olive doesn't make a lot of oil. You pickle it, you vinegar it up, and you use it for eating. But you don't make it and press it because a lot of oil doesn't come out of it. And then you have the oil olive. And that's something that if you press it, lots and lots of oil comes out. And vice versa, you also have like for grapes where some of the grapes, you wouldn't turn into wine, you turn into raisins. By the way, there's a good Gemara in Masechet Demai that says in Eretz Yisrael, they didn't really use the grapes for turning into raisins. They brought the grapes in from other regions outside of Eretz Yisrael to turn to raisins, because the ones that were here were of such high quality and produced so much wine that that's what they were used for. But Masechet Demai is saying that the grapes that came from outside of the land, those were made into raisins. Those weren't really made into wine because the quality of the product wasn't as good. So the Gemara says, based on what should he determine the required amount where he separates truma from oil on behalf of these olives. In other words, you have these olives that you're going to turn into the food, you're going to pickle them, and they have some nice things they do here in Eretz Yisrael. They'll put in sliced lemon and chili peppers and olive oil with the salt in the olives, and they pickle them, and they're delicious. And how do you determine it? In other words, should he make this determination based on the oil? In other words, the volume of the oil that these olives could produce if you were going to not eat it but turn it into olive oil? Or do you base it upon the volume of the olives themselves? In other words, on the food. How do you determine this? In other words, this person decided he's not going to crush the olives for oil. He's going to eat them. He's going to pickle them and eat them. And so how do you calculate the truma based on the volume? Do you calculate it based on the olives themselves or on how much oil this thing can produce? And this is a Maloket Tanayim. Rabbi Yochanan said, I learned an answer from what Hilfai says in a Baraisa, and Rebbe says about this that the calculation is based on their oil. In other words, the oil that the olives could produce. And Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says it is based on their food. In other words, the olives themselves, but not including the seeds. In other words, you're going to, seeds are not classified as food. And so when you're calculating the volume of the oils for calculating how much truma to separate, you're going to look at the meat of the olives. And Rebbe's answer is an interesting one. He's basically saying that, if you have olives that you could use for oil, and you decided, because that's the normal use of it, and you decided to use these, oil olives to pickle them instead, well, you should be determining them based upon the oil that they could have produced. So the Gemara continues and says, everybody agrees. In other words, both Tanaim agree regarding kalushin, which are only for eating. These are these inferior olives that they only pickle these ones. They're not turning these ones into olive oil. And basically on that one, everybody agrees that you separate truma based on their food and not on their seeds. In other words, you calculate how much waste would be from the seed. So let's say the olive pit might take up something like, a third or 40% of an olive, and the rest is going to be meat. And then, you'd say, okay, here's how much the volume is, and let me give my truma based on that. And regarding these ones that are only based on eating, everybody agrees. There's no maloket on there. What we're dealing with is that you had these oil olives, and instead of turning them to olive oil, you decided to pickle them instead. So Hananya asked a question. It says, does it also apply to the law of carrying on Shabbos? In other words, are olives intended for eating viewed as though they were oil, in which case, what's going to be the minimum shear? That's going to be a rivis with the law of liquid. Or are you going to look at this like food, where the minimum amount that you can carry is going to be a dried fig? That's the law for a solid food. And the Gemara replies. It says, the Baraisa was taught in regard to carrying olives on Shabbos, and Rebbe says they are liable for carrying a rivis, as with the laws of liquids. And Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says that they're liable for carrying a volume as a dried fig, as with the law of solid food. In other words, these two Tanaim are consistent with their opinions with respect to Truma and also with respect to Shabbos. And Rebbe is viewing the olives in terms of the oil they could produce, and Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel views it with the solid food condition. And the Brisa teaches that if somebody, that one of our Mishnah's rulings supports the law taught in the Brisa. Rabbi Hanania said in the name of Rabbi Hillel, we can also learn from the Mishnah a support for the following taught by Rabbi Hoshaya. It says, if someone separated truma from olives on behalf of olives, and he's going to go crush all of them, or grapes on behalf of grapes, and he's going to press all of them, it is valid truma, but he must separate out truma again. So in other words, we might have thought that since both the truma and the product for which it's going to be designated are the same type, that the separation should be valid. And Rabbi Hoshaya is teaching and saying, no, that's not so. Rather, these olives are meant to be crushed for their oil, and they're unprocessed. And so one may not separate truma from this one on behalf of that one. And if you did separate on this one on behalf of that one, you have to separate out truma again. And you have to do it after all the oil has been, all the olives have been turned into oil, or the grapes have been turned into wine. So, the Pnei Moshe is saying that this is talking about if the second separation is lost, and the rabbi is obligated somebody to replace the lost truma, so that the Goan will purify himself with chatas water in order to eat the new truma, or for the producer to purify himself in order to make the new batch of wine or oil. And this decree is to prevent the chatas water from falling into disuse. So, in this case, they're basically going to be saying that you didn't finish the processing, and you have to basically, if it's existing, you have to redesignate it, and if it's lost, you have to replace it. So we learned a proof of this in the Mishnah. Says the Gemara that if one separated truma from oil on behalf of olives that are intended for eating, or olives on behalf of olives that are intended for eating, or wine on behalf of grapes that are intended for eating, or grapes on behalf of grapes that are intended for eating, and then he reconsiders and he decides to press them, he does not need to separate out truma again. So what are we talking about? We're saying that, look, I have these olives, and they're oil olives, and I pickled them. And now, for whatever reason, he decides to press them. And they were already designated as a finished product. They've already started as a product. And now you changed your intention, you changed your mind, and you went to go produce something else. So you were allowed to do a separation on behalf of a finished product for something that's in the start of processing to be a finished product. We already learned that. So now it's saying that, what if you change your intention? Are you allowed, do you have to re-separate it? And it's saying, no, it's valid. And so, like, if we had in this case where we just took the grapes and we put them up on the roof, and they're not raisins yet, and then you decided, and you separate out, some truma for the wine on behalf of the grapes, that's valid, it's done. Now what if you decided to come and turn the grapes from the roof into wine? Do you have to do a new separation? No. This was already in the process of being a finished product, even though it was a different one. So you don't need to separate out truma again. So this Mishnah is implying, says the Gemara, that only because he originally intended to eat the olives or the grapes as raisins, and then he reconsidered and decided to crush them, is he exempt from separating out truma again. However, had he not reconsidered but was planning all along to crush the olives and the grapes, it is valid truma, but he must separate truma again. And this implies like what Rabbi Hoshaya was teaching. In other words, if somebody separated truma from olives that are intended to be eaten, or from oil, both of which are processed, or on behalf of olives that are intended to eating, also processed, the truma is valid and a second separation is not required. And since he separated the truma in a permitted way, for no unprocessed, there's no unprocessed produce being involved in here. So the rabbis didn't insist on the second separation. And this Mishnah is teaching that this ruling applies even if somebody changes his mind after the designation and decides to press the olives rather than eating them. Now, the Mishnah is also implying that this ruling holds true only if he made the decision to crush the olives after he designated the truma. But if he intended to crush them all along, even before designation, he has to separate out truma again, in which case the olives were unprocessed when the truma was separated. So, in other words, if he went ahead and did this designation, but he didn't actually start the process of crushing of processing the grapes into raisins, or doing anything to start to process the oil olives into food. He didn't start to do anything in the process, and then he designates it. That's not going to be valid. He has to separate it again. Why? Because he didn't start the process yet to turn it into a finished product. Even though he had the intention to make it a finished product, he didn't actually start the process yet. So they're saying that he has to separate it out again. The Mishnah stated that one may not separate truma from something whose processing is not completed on behalf of something whose processing is not completed. In other words, you can't separate out oil olives on behalf of oil olives that they didn't start the process yet with. So the Gemara wants to seek a scriptural source for the ruling, and Rabbi Imi says in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, that's written in the Torah, and your truma shall be reckoned for you like the grain from the threshing floor and like the ripeness of the vat. And this, by the way, is in Numbers 18:27. And this is a commandment to the Leviim to separate out Trumas Meiser from the Meiser Rishon. And the verse is stipulating that the separation is going to take place after the grain has been processed on the threshing floor, or after the olives or the grapes have been processed in a vat. And based on that, which the verse commands the Leviim to separate Trumas Meiser from processed produce, we see that the verse teaches that it is forbidden to give unprocessed ears of grain to a kohen as truma. Now, the Gemara is going to look at another ruling. In other words, it's going to say, if you went ahead and started the processing and did things out of order, is this going to be a Doraita violation, or is this going to be a Derabanan violation? The answer is going to be a Derabanan violation. But it's going to look awful lot like a Doraita violation. So, because of an asmata. So, the Gemara is going to talk about this ruling, this other ruling. And so, Rabbi Chia, and so in the last ruling we just said, basically included in this prohibition is that if you were, you can't designate unprocessed ears of grain as truma for other unprocessed ears of grain. That's what that's saying. In other words, unprocessed for unprocessed, you didn't start the thing, you can't do it. Okay. What if you did it out of order? The Torah commands us as one of the 613 commandments to do your tithes in order. But what happens if the Levi comes and separates the tithes out of order? So Chia Bar Ada says in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, in the case of Meiser Rishon that a Levi took early, when the grain is still ears and not yet subject to tithing, one is forbidden to eat from it, even casually. In other words, that, if the Levi took Meiser Rishon, even before it was processed, it becomes absolute tevel until Trumas Meiser is separated from it, which is going to be prohibited even for casual consumption. So under normal circumstances, produce does not become tevel until it's processed, and only does the obligation of tithing take effect from there. So while it's unprocessed, it's not tevel, and it's biblically permitted in all matter of consumption. But the rabbis decreed that one may not eat unprocessed produce in a formal fashion, only casually. Only you can pluck it a little bit by a little bit. And this Gemara is teaching that if you designated the unprocessed produce as Meiser Rishon, it became tevel even at a biblical level. And basically, that you might have, if you're eating like other tevel and it's Doraita tevel, you get penalty of death. It's very serious. So the Gemara is going to give a biblical source for this to say what is the reason, and it's going to say that the sanctities of the children of Israel you shall not desecrate, so that you shall not die. In other words, this is Numbers 18:32, and this is saying that you have to separate out your tithes so that you're not eating tevel, and eating tevel that's Doraita tevel, there's death from heaven. So the Gemara is going to basically be asking the following question: that if you did the tithing out of order, if the Levi does the tithing out of order, is this biblical tithe? Is this biblical tevel that he eats? Because there's no truma gadola that's taken out of it. Again, this is still attached from the ground, and this is product that's still attached to the ground. So the Gemara asks, or even grain that's still in the ears. In other words, that there's no smoothing yet that happened, and this is really either attached to the ground, or this has just been picked and the ears are still there. And the Gemara asks and says, what is the law as to whether somebody gets lashes for eating this kind of tevel? In other words, where the unprocessed Meiser Rishon is going to be there, and it hasn't, Shumas Meiser hasn't been separated yet, and is this going to be according to biblical law, or is this going to be D'Rabbanan? So, if you've eaten unprocessed Meiser Rishon, which is tevel, do you get a biblical punishment of lashes for disobeying? The Gemara answers. Rabbi Ashayan says in the name of Rabbi Yonah that a Mishnah states that one does not incur lashes for this tevel according to biblical law, and we learned in a Mishnah over there in Beurim 2:3 that Trumas Meiser is similar to Beurim in two ways, and to Truma in two ways, and that Truma Meiser may be taken from Tahor produce on behalf of Tamei produce, and from produce that is not in close proximity to the rest of the produce, just like Beurim. And on the other hand, Trumas Meiser forbids the product on the threshing floor, and it has a measure, just like Truma. So the Gemara is going to explain this proof. It's going to say, the Tana of the Mishnah, are saying that Trumas Meiser forbids the product of the threshing floor. And when the Mishnah says threshing floor, it does not mean after the smoothing of the pile. So in other words, the Mishnah is indicating that Truma Meiser renders Meiser Rishon forbidden only after the Meiser Rishon has been processed. And the Gemara tells us that one does not incur lashes for eating tevel, which is going to be unprocessed Meiser Rishon, from the Trumas Meiser that has yet to be separated according to biblical law. In other words, the Mishnah in Beurim is indicating that unprocessed Meiser Rishon is not tevel according to biblical law, and such Meiser Rishon is tevel only by a rabbinic decree. And so somebody who eats unprocessed Meiser Rishon violates a rabbinic law, but he does not get the biblical penalty of lashes for eating tevel, nor does he get that from heaven. Have a great day.